Sagittarius, the door she never truly closed. There are doors we believe we have closed simply because we stopped walking toward them. But the truth is, some doors remain half open, breathing quietly behind us, waiting for the day we are finally strong enough to return. The afternoon light was soft, the kind that turns dust into tiny floating galaxies. A quiet house, a half-packed box, and in the middle of it all, the kind of silence Sagittarius knows too well. The silence that comes not from peace, but from all the things she has decided not to feel. As you walk with me now, Sagittarius, imagine this moment. A cardboard box tucked in the corner, a stack of old notebooks, and then a letter slipping out like a breath you didn't mean to release. A letter written by the person who once hurt you the most. A letter you never opened. A letter you didn't know still existed. It's strange, isn't it? How the past has a way of returning. Not loudly, not violently, but with a kind of tenderness that disarms you. Almost as if it has been waiting for the right version of you to meet it again. Tonight, we're not here to reopen old wounds. We're here to walk into the soft truth you once turned away from, not because you were weak, but because you were surviving. This story isn't about him or about what he did. It's about you. The you who hid a part of herself inside a sealed envelope, hoping time would dissolve it. So breathe, Sagittarius. Let's step into the dim hallway of memory together. Let's see what happens when a door you never fully closed quietly calls your name again. Map 1. The faces she thought she had forgotten. The apartment filled with quiet dust. The move was supposed to be simple. A practical shift from an old apartment into a space with better light, better windows, and a better promise of a new beginning. Yet as Elena knelt on the cool wooden floor, peeling open boxes she hadn't touched in years, the air felt strangely heavy, like the past had been waiting behind the cardboard. The sun was sinking, casting a golden wash across the room, turning floating dust into slow-motion snow. It was in this quiet, accidental beauty that she found the letter. Sealed, yellowed, its edges softened by time. Her name was written in a handwriting she once knew as well as her own breath. Just one glance at the loops and curves of those letters was enough to tug open a door inside her chest she hadn't visited in years. Not because she had closed it, but because she had learned to walk around it. The man who lived in her winter. She didn't open the envelope. Not yet. Instead, the sight of it pulled her gently into a memory, a winter years ago when she first noticed him. His name was Daniel, though in her mind he was never a name but a presence. A soft pause in the world. A warm coat in the cold. They met on a day the sky was the color of unfinished silver. She remembered how he stood at the bus stop, snow gathering on his hair, eyes lowered as if he carried a quiet universe no one else could read. There was something about the way he listened, the way he tilted his head slightly when she spoke, that made her believe he saw beyond surfaces. Sagittarius hearts recognized light before they recognized danger, and in Daniel she thought she saw light. Not brilliance, not sparks, just a kind of steady glow that made her breathe easier. Back then that was enough. The seeds of hope she pretended not to notice. Even now, years later, the memory unfolded with the softness of a film she once loved but could no longer watch. She recalled the first detail that made her chest warm. How he once held the bus door for an elderly woman without a hint of performance. Or how he noticed she always ordered her coffee too hot, and began blowing gently on the lid before handing it to her, saying, "You always burn your tongue." It was small, tender, almost invisible. But Sagittarius hearts are like constellations. They connect small points of light into meaning. And Elena, without realizing it, had begun stitching him into a story before she even knew she was doing it. The hope he gave her wasn't loud. It was quiet, like a hand resting lightly on her back. Enough to steady her. Enough to make her believe again. The letter that shouldn't still exist. Back in the apartment, Elena sat with the letter resting on her palm like a soft weight. She could feel the ghost of her younger self, the girl who once waited for explanations, who believed in the goodness of people long after they stopped showing it. The girl who kept giving chances until it tore something inside her. She swallowed, realizing the strangeness of it all. This letter should have been lost, thrown away, dissolved into time. But it wasn't. It had found her again. Or maybe she thought she had finally stopped running far enough to let it catch up. The room was quiet, except for the sound of her breath shifting. And though she didn't open the envelope yet, she felt it, the unmistakable pull of a story she thought she had buried. nudging her gently back toward the door she never truly closed. Map 2. The colors memory painted for her. The moments that became brushstrokes. Elena leaned back against the half-unpacked boxes, and it amazed her how memories could return with such clarity. Not the big ones, but the small, almost embarrassing details she thought she had forgotten. Like the afternoon they first sat together on a park bench because the cafe was full. They drank coffee in paper cups, warmth seeping into their hands, and she remembered how he asked, "Do you ever feel like life moves faster than you can?" It wasn't a profound question, but the way he said it, soft, unguarded, made her feel as though he had opened a window inside himself and let her look in. Sagittarius hearts rarely fall for declarations. They fall for sincerity disguised as accidents. And that day Elena felt seen. Not the whole of her, but enough to spark something she didn't dare name. The first conversation that woke her hope. She smiled without meaning to when another memory surfaced. Their first real conversation, the one that made her think, maybe I'm safe here. They were walking home in early evening, the sky painted with lavender shadows. She had said something about being tired of pretending she was fine all the time. He didn't rush to soothe her, didn't offer solutions, didn't make her feel dramatic. He simply looked at her steady and kind and whispered, "You don't have to pretend with me." The simplicity of that sentence had once felt like a revelation. It wasn't romance, not yet. It was permission. Sagittarius souls crave connection layered in honesty. And in that moment, she believed he could meet her at the depth she lived in. She didn't realize she was already drawing the first outlines of a story. The signs she thought the universe was sending. There were other moments too, ones she had brushed off as coincidence then, but treasured privately as signs. Like the day their paths crossed 3 times in one morning, each encounter softer than the last. Or the way he remembered the book she had mentioned only once and later quoted a line from it, offhand but precise. Or how he always seemed to appear at the exact moment she needed someone to walk with. It's funny, she thought, how Sagittarius can take a handful of gentle gestures and turn them into constellations. She had taken every small kindness and hung it in the sky like a star, until the whole night glowed with possibility. Looking back now, she could see it clearly. She hadn't fallen for him. She had fallen for the hope he awakened inside her. The version of him she painted existed more vividly than the real man ever did. The soft insight she didn't want to face. Sitting alone with the unopened letter, she finally admitted something she had avoided for years. She had loved what she imagined he could be, not who he consistently was. He had given her flickers of warmth, yes, but she had built a fire from them. He had shown her corners of sincerity, but she had drawn whole rooms. Sagittarius hearts are storytellers, brilliant ones, but sometimes they forget to separate intuition from projection. Elena saw now that she had filled in the blanks with her own longing. And yet, even understanding that, the ache in her chest didn't disappear. Because the story she wrote with him wasn't just about him. It was about the part of herself she had allowed to hope again. And losing that felt like losing light. Map 3. Where the truth quietly revealed itself, the meeting that was supposed to clarify everything. There was a time, long before the letter resurfaced, when Elena had tried to understand what they truly were. She remembered the evening vividly. A small cafe tucked behind an alley, windows fogged from the warmth inside. She had chosen that place because it felt safe, dim, almost cinematic, the kind of place where difficult conversations softened around the edges. Daniel arrived late, apologizing with that familiar half-smile that once melted her, though even in that moment she sensed something distant in his eyes. They sat across from each other, steam rising from their cups. For a while they talked about ordinary things, work, the weather, a movie he had watched. But beneath his words was an absence she could feel more than hear. A subtle disconnection, like he was present but hovering just a few inches away from himself. Sagittarius hearts are sensitive to atmospheric shifts. She sensed something was off long before he said anything. And that was the evening she began to see the cracks in the version of him she had painted. The words that didn't fit the version she had created. The truth didn't come in a dramatic confession. Came quietly, almost accidentally. He had said in a soft, careless tone, "I'm not really someone who goes deep. I prefer to keep things light, simple, you know? Just one sentence. A harmless one, objectively. But to Elena, it felt like watching the portrait she had carefully drawn blur at the edges. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't distant on purpose. He was simply not the man she had believed him to be. Not the one who could sit with her in the heavy places. Not the one who reached for meaning the way she did. She remembered nodding slowly, giving a small smile, while inside a quiet truth unspooled. She had never actually known him, not in the way her heart insisted she had. And in that realization, something gentle but irreversible shifted. The moment she saw their mismatch clearly. Later that night, as they walked toward the train station, she noticed how their steps didn't align. She talked about a poem that had moved her recently. He shrugged and said he didn't get why people complicate things with feelings. It wasn't dismissive, just honest. And in that honesty lived the truth she had refused to look at. He was not built for the kind of emotional depth she lived in. He was all surface calm, all gentle simplicity. She was fire and philosophy in spaces that demanded resonance. The mismatch wasn't dramatic. No raised voices, no heartbreak scene under a streetlight. It was quiet, almost tender. Like life whispering, "This isn't your mirror." Mirror psychology unfolded softly within her. She realized she had been looking for someone who could understand the parts of her she had long misunderstood herself. The soft collapse of a story she had built. When she reached home that night, she didn't cry. Instead, she sat on the edge of her bed and let the truth settle. She had loved a story, not a person. She had filled silences with meaning he didn't intend. She had mistaken his moments of presence for promises. Sagittarius hearts often fall not for who someone is, but for who they genuinely believe that person could become. And when the real version finally stands before them, gentle, imperfect, insufficiently deep, it doesn't break them violently. It simply dissolves the illusion they had been holding on to. That night was the beginning of her letting go. A letting go that didn't complete itself until years later, when the letter she never opened found its way back into her hands. Map 4. When the heart writes its own story, why she painted him in the first place. Elena sat on the floor, the unopened letter resting lightly against her knee, and she finally allowed herself to ask the question she had avoided for years. Why did I make him into more than he was? The answer wasn't about Daniel. It was about the emptiness she carried back then. She had been lonely in the way only Sagittarius can be, surrounded by people, but feeling unseen in the depth of her emotions. When he appeared with his quiet kindness and soft attention, she didn't fall in love with him. She fell in love with what her heart had been starving for. A gentle presence, a hint of safety, a small glimmer of connection. Those fragments became colors, and those colors became a portrait she mistook for truth. It wasn't delusion, it was longing dressed as clarity, the layers of her inner psychology. Sagittarius doesn't idealize because they are naive, they idealize because they see potential everywhere. And Elena, with her hopeful heart, projected that potential onto him. Idealization turned quiet gestures into promises. Hope projection took coincidence and turned it into destiny. She chose to see his warmth and ignored his emotional absences. She chose the light he occasionally offered instead of acknowledging the shadows he consistently carried. Underneath it all was a fear she never voiced. What if this small connection is the best I will ever find? That fear made her hold on to the imagined version of him, as if it were a lifeline. And yet, the truth was simple and painful. She wasn't afraid of losing him, she was afraid of facing the emptiness he temporarily softened. The stories we tell to avoid the truth. As she traced the outline of the envelope with her thumb, she saw clearly how her mind had worked back then. Loneliness had created a space, and rather than sit in it, she filled it with narrative. She took his softness and wrote depth into it. She took his attention and crafted compatibility. She mistook brief emotional availability for real emotional capacity. And the hardest truth? She wasn't seeing him at all. She was seeing her own hopes reflected back at her. Sagittarius often reads depth into things because they hope for depth, not because it's truly there. It's a beautiful gift, and a painful trap. A mirror for anyone listening. For the first time since that winter, Elena felt compassion for the version of herself who couldn't face reality. She wasn't foolish, she was human. She wasn't weak, she was trying to heal. She built a story because it was easier than sitting in the silence of unmet needs. And maybe Sagittarius listening now will feel that truth stir inside their own chest. Because haven't we all, at some point, written a story to avoid the truth? Haven't we all filled in the blanks because the reality felt too sharp? Elena wasn't alone in this pattern. She was simply the first version of herself brave enough to finally acknowledge it. And holding the letter now, she sensed it. She was ready to close a door not by force, but by understanding. Map 5. When Sagittarius steps out of her own story, choosing to let the story rest. Elena held the letter for a long moment, feeling the quiet weight of everything it represented. It was strange how something so light could carry years of emotion. She finally opened it, not to relive the past but to release it. Inside was an apology that arrived too late, written by a version of him who had learned regret only after she was gone. A softer man, a reflective man, but still not the man she had once imagined. As she read, she didn't feel the sharpness of old wounds. Instead, she felt a gentle recognition. This was never about him. It was about her heart closing itself in a moment of pain and never finding the courage to return. Setting the letter down, she breathed out fully. Not dramatically, not brokenly, but with the quiet relief of someone finally able to stand outside the story she once wrote and walk away from it. Accepting him as he truly was. She didn't hate him. Not anymore. He gave what he could, with the limited emotional vocabulary he had. But he was never capable of meeting her where she lived. In the deep layers, the emotional undercurrents, the quiet truths beneath the surface. And even now, reading his apology, she understood. He hadn't intentionally hurt her. He had simply been unable to love her in the language she needed. Sagittarius hearts often forgive easily, but releasing the fantasy is the real challenge. Elena accepted him, not the version she painted, not the version she hoped for, but the human version. Flawed, limited, sincere in small ways, but not her mirror. And acceptance, she realized, was the doorway she had needed all along. The healing that comes from seeing clearly. With the letter folded gently beside her, Elena recognized a truth she had avoided for too long. She hadn't been wounded by him, but by her expectations of him. Hope can be beautiful, but when it attaches itself to the wrong person, it becomes a kind of self-inflicted ache. She whispered to herself, "I forgive you for believing too quickly." And for the first time, it didn't sound like self-blame, it sounded like courage. Healing for Sagittarius is learning to love without creating a story. To see people as they truly are, not as who they could be. To keep the heart open but the eyes honest. That's how she would walk forward now. With vision, not projection. With clarity, not longing. A soft message for Sagittarius. If you're listening to this, Sagittarius, maybe you too have a door you never closed, not because you still want the past, but because part of you never faced it. Perhaps you painted someone in colors they never truly wore. Perhaps you wrote chapters that only existed in your imagination. That doesn't make you foolish. It makes you human. It makes you someone who loves deeply, hopes fiercely, and searches for meaning in places others overlook. But now it may be time to step out of the story you wrote and into the truth that waits for you. May you walk forward with open eyes, open heart, and a newfound softness toward yourself. And when you're ready, share your story, because somewhere out there, another Sagittarius is waiting to realize they are not alone.